Leon Panetta 2024 Lecture Series, 2024 and the Challenges to Democracy at Home and Abroad. This lecture discusses the challenge of the 2024 election, a united or divided America. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sylvia Panetta.
Good evening, everyone. What a wonderful turnout. And it's with great pleasure that I welcome all of you to the final event of this year's Leon Panetta Lecture Series, live here in Leon's hometown of Monterey at the beautiful Monterey Conference Center. This evening, we conclude our series of discussions on the challenges facing our democracy at home and at abroad. Tonight, we will turn our focus to what will certainly determine the future of our democracy, the 2024 presidential election. A majority of Americans have expressed concerns about both candidates, their ages. Both are the oldest candidates to run for president. Both have failed to unify a divided nation. Both are facing serious problems. We now have the first president of the United States to be convicted of a crime and facing other multiple charges. The other is struggling with low polls as a result of Americans worried about inflation, about immigration, and a war in the Middle East. But one thing is for sure. On November 5th, the voters will face a real choice between two very different views on issues that will impact the future of this nation. On the rule of law, immigration, abortion, health care, climate change, energy, accepting the results of free and fair elections, national security, and world leadership. Whoever is elected will swear an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. But as we found out on the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol, there can be very different interpretations of the requirements of the Constitution. The presidential election of 2024 will define the future of our democracy. Because of the deep divisions in our country, will voters turn out to vote for the best candidate, or will they stay home? For over 230 years, our system of checks and balances has worked to limit the centralization of power. Now will that continue? There was a time when both parties shared a set of common values about America that inspired them to work together. Will divisions continue to disrupt our democracy, or will both parties unify to govern? Leon will pose these questions to three experts who understand presidential campaigns, who know what goes on behind closed doors at the White House, and who understand the global implications of this historic presidential contest. Now, our first guest is a preeminent American political strategist and commentator, and the former chief strategist and senior advisor to President Barack Obama. A former political writer for the Chicago Tribune, he produced media strategy and advertising for 150 campaigns across the United States, culminating in President Obama's historic election. He was the founding director of the University of Chicago's Nonpartisan Institute of Politics and currently serves as a distinguished fellow at the University of Chicago and as a senior political commentator for CNN. He is the host of the Axe Files, a top-rated podcast featuring in-depth conversations with public figures across the political spectrum. He's also the author of the New York Times best-selling memoir, Believer, My 40 Years in Politics. So please welcome David Axelrod. Our second guest is President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations, a veteran diplomat and respected scholar of international relations. He served in the State Department under President George W. Bush and Ronald Reagan, at the White House under George H.W. Bush, and at the Pentagon under Jimmy Carter. He was U.S. envoy to the Cyprus negotiations and the Northern Ireland peace process, and after 9/11, was U.S. coordinator for the future of Afghanistan. He is the author or editor of 14 books on American foreign policy, 1 book on management, and 1 on American democracy. His latest book, The Bill of Obligations, The 10 Habits of Good Citizens, was published in 2023 and became a New York Times bestseller. He also authors a weekly newsletter called Home and Away. He's the recipient of the State Department's Superior Honor Award, the Presidential Citizens Medal, and the Tipperary International Peace Award. Please welcome Dr. Richard Haass. Our final guest was named White House Chief of Staff shortly after the 2016 presidential campaign. Prior to managing the White House staff, he was the longest-serving chairman of the Republican National Committee in modern history. He oversaw a dramatic turnaround of the RNC, rescuing its finances, repairing its operations, and rebuilding its ground game. He left the RNC the winningest chairman of either political policy in American history. He was named by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people in the world in 2016 and 2017. Before serving as RNC chairman, he was the most successful chairman of the Republican Party of Wisconsin. During his tenure, the state's Republicans elected Ron Johnson in the Senate, Scott Walker as governor, gained 2 additional U.S. House seats, and took back both the State Assembly and Senate, defeating the Democratic leaders of both those chambers. Today, he serves as chairman of the host committee for the Republican National Convention that will be held in Milwaukee this July. Please welcome Reince Priebus. And of course, moderating our discussion is the man who created this lecture series, the former United States representative for this district and the former director of the CIA and Secretary of Defense. He understands campaigns and elections, and most importantly, he has dedicated his career to ensuring that the next generation is prepared to be stewards of our democracy. Please welcome Secretary Leon Panetta.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 4th and final lecture of our 2024 lecture series. couldn't have come at a better time. We happen to follow the news very closely. Our theme has been the challenges of democracy at home and abroad. And it's fair to say that probably the biggest challenge to our democracy in America will be who is elected president in November of 2024. Which candidate poses the biggest threat to the future of the country, and which candidate will make the lives of Americans better off than they are today? The American people have made clear, as Sylvia pointed out in polling, that they have concerns about both candidates. And now, one is the first president of the United States to be convicted of a crime and facing other multiple charges, and the other is struggling with low polls from concerns about inflation, immigration, and the war in the Middle East. And yet, there are dramatically stark differences here between these two candidates. The voters will face a real and defining choice in the direction of our country. It's hard to believe, and I was there at the time, when both political parties, despite their differences on issues, shared a common set of beliefs and values on how presidents should behave, on how democracy should be governed, on how justice should be enforced, and how our national security should be protected. Why has that changed? Why have we allowed partisan disinformation and lies to undermine our ability to listen to one another and to work together? Can we still trust the institutions of our democracy to protect its survival? Some of the most profound questions, really, of our time. And we'll discuss as many of those as we can with our great speakers this evening. Let me begin by what is in the news, obviously, with regards to the conviction. The president was found guilty of 34 counts by a jury that was selected both by the prosecution and the defense. Is this a turning point? Will the conviction make any difference in the campaign for the presidency?
Well,
David?
yeah, it used to be that we would say, we want a man of convictions, but I don't think this is what we were, this isn't what we were talking about. I really don't know what this will mean. The early returns in polling are that it may not mean that much. I think that after all that has transpired, all the indictments, this trial and so on, I think people have a pretty good sense of who Donald Trump is, and I think that his moral and ethical liabilities are sort of baked in the cake of this discussion. And the question is whether people are willing to overlook those because they think he offers something else. You know, the Republican message is very clear. I can let Reince articulate it, but it's that, you know, the world's out of control and Biden's not in command, and Trump is strong, and he will address the things that are ailing people. And does that override their concerns about his character? You know, we'll see. But I think what we're looking forward to, what we were looking forward to before this trial and before this verdict, was a very close race that is going to be decided by a handful of states. And I think we are still there. And I don't think this has changed much, at least in the short run.
Richard?
I'd say two things. First, I think support for Donald Trump, support for Joe Biden, it is what it is. The real question is whether this influences the behavior of that small percentage of Americans who haven't made up their minds. No party affiliation, independence, and maybe, but as David correctly says, it's going to be a close-run election. So small numbers could make big differences. What I'm more confident about, and I say this without any enthusiasm, is I think the impact of what happened, the conviction, on American democracy. And that, I think, is bad. You already had a situation where large numbers of Democrats had lost confidence in the Supreme Court because of various decisions, various judges who were appointed by Donald Trump and others. And then now what you have is a large number of Republicans, Trump supporters, who see this trial, see this verdict, and basically said it never should have happened, this is politically inspired, this is overreach. And I worry about the future of American democracy, Leon, without a legal system that enjoys broad legitimacy. We need the courts to be the ultimate decider, to be, to use a sportsman, to be the umpire, the referee, and it happens frequently. And right now, what worries me is we could have decisions that are not widely accepted. And I don't think it's crazy that in the not too distant future, we could have states beginning to say, we do not accept that decision. And we here in the States, we don't accept this legislation. We're going to go our own way. And we've had this experience once before in our history. I don't mean to be melodramatic about where it leads, but I do have real concerns that this has increased polarization and increased the suspicion of institutions. And democracy without institutions that enjoy broad support is a democracy that has grown brittle.
Reince?
Well, first of all, it's great to be here. I'm thankful you're all here. I hope you have a great time tonight. Thank the Secretary, Chief of Staff, Director of the CIA, OMB, right?
Oh, yeah.
Congressman.
Why couldn't you hold a job? That's what we
Amazing.
That's why I'm here in Monterey.
You should answer all these questions. So I agree with both of these guys. Want to explain something to everybody, because I know we're not all on the same page. We have different views. I think that's part of what we need more of, right, in this country, of people like us getting together and having a debate, still like each other. That's important. But this issue of fairness is always through the lens of, whoever we're talking to. And there is a group of people in this country, that's a big group of people, that think what happened in New York wasn't fair. That when you have an elected district attorney that says, while he's campaigning for district attorney, that I am the guy here running for district attorney that knows how to get the Trump organization, because I've sued them over 100 times, I've sued their kids, I've sued Trump, I know how to get this guy more than anybody, so you need to elect me as your next district attorney. Then I become district attorney, and I find out that, oh, darn it, the business records violation, the statute of limitations run, and I can't get them anymore. So now I come up with another theory. I'm going to take the misdemeanor, I'm going to hook a federal crime to that misdemeanor, and I'm going to go to court on this case. Now, we talk about institutions, the threat to democracy. Just remember, whether you're Republican or Democrat, if you're a Democrat, the Republican answering that question thinks that Biden's a threat to democracy. The Biden supporter thinks Trump's a threat to democracy. The one thing I can tell you, I think with certainty, that this case and conviction has brought, it's taken the Republican voter, and more importantly from a campaign standpoint, the Republican worker, meaning who's doing the yard signs, who's knocking the doors. That person went to a level 10. And when you look at the money that they're raising because of this conviction, but let's go back to the campaign, because David said it right. This election is not a national election. You know that very well, being here in California. This is an election in 6 states to elect the president. But more than that, it's an election where 100,000 people in those 6 states total are going to decide the outcome. Now, if I need to win, if I take $5 billion and I go after that group of people, one thing I need are enthusiastic people that'll walk over glass for their candidate. And the one thing that this did was create a whole group of people that went from level 5 to level 10. And that helps Donald Trump.
So,
Go ahead.
sorry. No, I just want to say a couple of things. I meant to say earlier, Chris Christie did a podcast that I do last week, and he said something I thought was really insightful, which is it may not be how the voters react to the verdict, but how Trump reacts to the verdict, and whether he becomes even more angry, even more paranoid, even more self-absorbed, because he is not an attractive candidate when he is doing that. And it may rile up the base, but he needs more than that. He certainly needs to get the base out. The second thing I wanted to say is I wasn't crazy about the New York case. I said at the beginning, if you have to use the words porn star and novel legal theory in the same sentence, maybe you should consider whether this is the right case to bring. That said, there are serious, serious charges against Donald Trump that are not at all frivolous. I mean, a jury decided that case, not the prosecutor, but a jury decided that case. But set that aside. My concern is Donald Trump has made it very clear if he gets elected, he is going to order the Justice Department to drop the prosecutions against him for his role in conspiring to overturn a free and fair election and for purloining top secret documents from the White House and then trying to hide them from the FBI, and those cases will be dropped. What does that say about the rule of law? What does that say about the rule of law? So we can talk about Alvin Bragg's campaign and so on. There are bigger issues here that are of concern. Now, that doesn't mean people are going to vote on those issues, because I've said it many times, if you're sitting around the kitchen table talking about democracy, it's probably because you don't have to worry about how much the food on the table cost. And there are people who may have superseding and more immediate concerns than the future of democracy. And there may be a bunch of people who don't feel like democracy is functioning in their interest right now. But I do care about democracy. I think everybody in this room probably cares about democracy. And the election of Donald Trump would be, by definition, a watershed event in the rule of law, because it would mean that, yes, in America there are some people who are beyond the law.
Let me ask this. We've seen the the criticism and the concern, and Richard raised this with regards to our system of justice, and clearly Trump has basically leaned into our justice system as having been rigged. And basically tried to blame Biden and the Justice Department. But Hunter Biden is going to be tried. He's in trial right now. If Hunter Biden is found guilty, what does Trump then say about our system of justice?
Probably say it worked pretty well in that case. I don't know. I mean, you all know the answer there. But I think, too, look, in 2016, Donald Trump was elected the biggest middle finger the American people could find, okay? And he's judged through that lens. So, what really, to me, matters is and if you think about the campaign itself, is all these questions, what net effect does it have on the American people? I do think, obviously, all of these issues, when you've got all these criminal cases going on, it has an effect on all the things that you're talking about today and in this series. And people's belief that, justice isn't blind, and everyone has their own honest opinion of what that means. So, I don't think the jury did anything wrong in the course in New York, but I think the DA did. And I think district attorneys, I don't remember what Supreme Court justice said this, but a district attorney has the power to pick and choose what cases they prosecute. What that also means is that a district attorney has the power to pick and choose what defendants they prosecute. I don't think, there are very few people even on MSNBC and CNN and other stations, that really believe that if this defendant wasn't named Donald Trump, they would not have been prosecuted. And some may say the same about Hunter Biden. So, look, I think what's important is that people here realize that as passionate as you feel about Hunter Biden or Donald Trump, that there's somebody that sees this as very political. And I think for us to make believe that it's not political, I think is fantasy land.
One of the things that I find bewildering is that President Trump at once says Biden is senile, he's incompetent, he can't tie his own shoes, and he's the mastermind of this diabolical scheme to with local prosecutors and federal prosecutors, and he's plotting all of this out. But I agree with you, Reince. If he were plotting it all out, he certainly wouldn't have chosen this case to start
I think the
with.
phrase that the special prosecutor used was diminished faculties, right? That we're talking about that Biden suffers, according to their own special prosecutor.
Let me ask this about you guys. We're going to the debate, and the debates are now set for June 27th and September 10th.
On CNN.
On CNN, of course.
I'm contractually obligated to mention that.
And in 2020, they had two debates. It's fair to say that both were pretty chaotic. Trump doesn't like debates, I don't think. I mean, I'd be interested in your thoughts, Reince. He doesn't seem to want to participate. He didn't participate, obviously, in any of the primary debates. He doesn't like to take advice. Biden is going to go through the traditional prep that most candidates do. What is likely to happen in these 2024 debates? And let me ask you this. Did Trump make a mistake by agreeing to do the debate?
No, he did not. And I think that I think he's going to do well. And maybe Biden will do better than people think too. I'm assuming he probably will. Just like, he came out of the State of the Union and he was screaming from beginning to end, but it certainly showed he was alive and not about to keel over, so that helped him. I mean, anything that he does that sort of passes some minimal mark is going to be good for Joe Biden. I think that I think these debates are going to be very important. I think this is going to be a Super Bowl of debates. I think the ratings will be off the charts. It is like, one of the great super matches that in modern political history. I think they're going to matter a lot more to probably Biden than Trump. As you know, Trump, he could. I don't think there's a whole lot he could do to hurt his standing in the polls from a debate. But I do think that the risk is on Biden, and I think that Biden made the strategic choice to get these debates started early, to do them on his terms. And I think because the Trump campaign was worried that Biden might not do any debates and there wouldn't be that opportunity to potentially show the country front and center with 50 million people watching, that this guy, in fact, does have diminished faculties, I'm going to take the debate. And so, it was worth President Trump to say yes to the debate, even if it was on Joe Biden's terms, because the risks, I think, to Biden were too great to pass up.
Richard, we've seen presidential debates in the past. Some have been pretty consequential. Kennedy over Nixon. We saw basically the whole thing with Dukakis when he made a mistake in one of the debates.
Carter Reagan,
another example of that. Reagan was very good in the debates and had his lines down. What do you think will be the consequences of this debate?
Well, all the examples you've just given, Leon, are proof that no one can predict what will be the takeaways. It's often something very, very particular that people listening or watching take away, or if they don't watch the debate, it's the things that social media or traditional media pick up and play again. So it's hard to say. I would say, though, what does each candidate have to do? And the question is whether they pass that hurdle. I think for Joe Biden, it gets us this question of competence. His structural weakness is age. And so it's everything from how he looks to how he walks across the stage, if they show that, to how he holds up in the course of the debate, and so forth. I think that becomes very important. I think for Donald Trump, it's character. And what I would hope is that people wouldn't just ask him narrow questions about policy, because one can give canned answers, but I would try to draw Donald Trump out on democracy. What is his notion or definition of democracy? What does he believe are his obligations as a president? What are the limits on what he could and should do, and so forth? What I hope is the journalists actually bring out things we don't already know, because we know an awful lot about these guys. And it ought not simply to be a night where they can rehearse their greatest hits. I don't think we as a citizenry will then get what we need. What I'm hoping is each is drawn out, because there's big question marks about each of them, and I hope we gain a little bit of insight into it.
David, you prepped a presidential
Yeah.
candidate for debates. What do you think?
I think a few things. One is that I do think that Trump will get probed on this. They both will get probed on some of these big issues. I actually think, yes, Biden has to pass a certain level of performance to, but the bar has been set very low, most readily by Donald Trump for Biden, which I think is a mistake. But I think that the challenge for Biden is not to engage in these issues, the debate about democracy. I think these democracy issues will come up, but I think he needs to set a contrast with Trump on very fundamental issues that affect people's lives, and on what he's done and what he will do about healthcare costs, about prescription drug costs, abortion rights. And there's a series of issues that I think are motivational to voters that really touch on their lives, in which he's one place and Trump is very much in another place. And I would be focused on delivering that. The trap for Biden is the same trap that incumbent presidents always face. It is historically the first debate for an incumbent president is often the worst debate, because presidents are inclined to, they have a lot of information and they're inclined to defend their records. We saw this painfully with President Obama in Denver. I still have tire tracks on my rear end from that. And Biden, his habit is to want to defend and extol his record. And debates are really performances. They're not, you come in, you know the points you want to make, and you want to land those points, because those points are the ones that are going to be remembered, that will go viral, that will define what the race is about. And Biden's going to have to do it with Donald Trump probably in his ear from start to finish, because that's Trump's habit. For Trump, I think the great risk, there was a focus group that I saw where a guy said, who voted for Trump in 2020, said, I voted for Trump in 2020. I don't know if I can do it again, because Trump as president is like having a neighbor who runs his leaf blower 24/7. He said, I can't get any sleep. And so if Trump is the leaf blower in this debate and reminds people of what life with Donald Trump is like, I think that there is a liability for him.
On the other hand, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
He wants to speak on behalf of leaf blowers.
In 2016, I led the debate prep for President Trump. Christie played Hillary. I was the moderator, and so I have some experience with this as well. The one thing I think is going to be a challenge, of course, adding on to your point about incumbents, is that unlike 2020, you know, when you're a challenger, you can just bomb away at the incumbent. This time, the one challenge I really think Biden's going to have is that after the democracy question's gone and after all the court cases and J6 and all that's out of the way, eventually they're going to have to talk about the issues. You know, why is gas so expensive? What's happening with the groceries? What's going on the border? And Biden's going to have to be ready for all those pivot points, because when you train these candidates, what you really do in a debate prep is you answer the question usually pretty quickly. And then the point is you answer and pivot. And so the candidates go in there trained to quickly answer and then quickly pivot on the attack back to your opponent. So Trump, you know, if he's planning properly, he'll pivot back to the actual issues. Yeah, okay, but why is gas so expensive? Okay, why is the economy in shambles? Why? And that's going to be, I think, tough for Biden. And I think that's probably going to be their game plan, to get Biden, you know, popping left and right with all these pivots.
Let me move on to this question that I think a lot of people are asking themselves. In Time magazine, in the interview with Trump, Time magazine said he clearly outlined, and I quote this, an imperial presidency, unquote. He does speak of being a dictator for a day, although he jokes about it. He has said that he will seek vengeance and retribution against his enemies. He'll use the Justice Department to go after Biden and his enemies. He'll establish migrant detention camps. He'll use the National Guard and the military, if necessary, to round up immigrants and deport them.
That's just the first day.
Yeah, that's the first day. Can Trump really become, if he so wants, to be a dictator for this country? Or will the institutions of democracy be strong enough to stop him? Richard?
Well, in part, it depends on the outcome of the election. We don't just have a presidential election this November. We'll see what happens in the Senate. I think it's more likely than not to go Republican. I defer to David on the House, which I think could go either way. So one question is whether, if Donald Trump were to be elected as president, whether the Republicans run the table. With the Senate, possibly the House, they've already got a Supreme Court that's shown itself, shall we say, to be leaning in that direction. Still, even with all that, I find the word dictator an overstatement, it's an exaggeration. I've studied enough about history around the world. I don't think we are vulnerable to that, but I think what we are potentially vulnerable to is what the academic phrase is to become an illiberal democracy, where the pendulum swings too much in the direction of presidential power and presidential discretion, and either you have a Congress, if it were Republican, that would be unwilling to oppose him. If it were Democrats, might be unable in some cases, where you have a court that's shown itself to be issuing decisions that don't show a lot of respect for precedent, quite radical. I mean, we don't have a conservative court, we have a radical court. And the Republican Party, full disclosure, I was a member of it for 40 years, has gone from being a conservative party to a more radical party. So it would give Donald Trump as president a lot of leeway. He already has it, by the way, in foreign policy. Who's ever elected president enjoys enormous discretion over American foreign policy, given the Constitution, given American political traditions. Most aspects of foreign policy the president can make without recourse to Congress. The recent vote on Ukraine aid was actually the exception. In most cases, presidents can pretty much do what they want when it comes to where troops are, the commitment of military force, signing agreements that aren't treaties, tremendous discretion in terms of what the executive can do. And domestically, again, you could do lots of things in terms of border policy. I actually think President Biden has far more discretion than he's been willing to exercise. I think it's been a significant political mistake. And there are legitimate questions about the use of the Justice Department, use of Treasury, things like regulatory policy, prosecution, and so forth. But we still have a free press. This is a society with a tremendous civil society in it. So when people use words like dictatorship and the rest, I think that's a serious overstatement. But I do think there's grounds for concern. And again, it actually, sorry to go on so long, but it goes beyond Donald Trump. Even without him, American democracy faces real challenges. And our institutions aren't performing. If you're a young person, just think about it, and you're under, say, 40, and you've grown up with 9/11, you've grown up with the 2007-8 financial crisis, the recent inflation, war in Iraq, war in Afghanistan, COVID, January 6th, you can say, I can see you saying, look, I see what democracy has done to me. I don't see an awful lot that it's done for me. So I think American democracy is vulnerable, and we're seeing it all over the world. Mm-hmm. The reason so many populists are winning around the world is people are frustrated with the status quo. When democracy isn't seen to deliver, it gets vulnerable. So American democracy is vulnerable right now, but I think it's wrong to just look at Donald Trump. I think we have structural challenges that he can exploit.
Let me say, it is no accident that the first foreign leader that Donald Trump met with after he won the nomination was Viktor Orban. And I think the Orbanization of American government is what Trump has in mind. That is to say, we will have a democracy in form, but not necessarily in content. That some of the institutions that we rely on to be strong and independent will be under attack. And when President Trump says that the Justice Department will respond to him, and he'll decide who they indict and don't indict. When he says he's going to take over some independent agents, he's going to hold, he'll decide what interest rates are and so on. I worry about, I am a journalist by training, and I revere journalism. I even revered journalism when I was in the White House, and they just pissed me off endlessly because I understood that they play an essential role in shining a bright light in the dark corners of our democracy. I worry about attempts to sort of bridle, and it'll be up to the courts in many cases to resist these things. I am not willing to say that our institutions aren't strong enough, but I know this: democracy relies on, to some degree, on the good faith of people who hold offices, and particularly the President of the United States. And the thing that I object to about Donald Trump is not about any issue. I have differences with him on issues, but I've had differences with a lot of presidents on issues and still had high regard for them because they were trustees of the democracy. Donald Trump does not believe in rules or laws or norms or institutions. Doesn't believe in them. He thinks they're for suckers, and that he doesn't have to abide by them. That's how he ends up in court here. We can say what we will about New York or any one of these indictments, but he has shown that he does not have a regard for the fundamental rules and laws and norms and institutions of our democracy. That puts us at risk.
Okay, one thing that's missing, I think what's missing here is sort of an acknowledgement that a huge part of our country, Republican and Democrat, they're let down by the old dogs of the Republican Party and the Democrat Party. They were left behind. When Ben Bernanke walked into the Oval Office in 2008 and said, "Mr. President, I need $1 trillion because of the housing crisis, and I need to save our American economy. And if I don't get after that, if I don't get the $1 trillion, we're going to lose Europe. And after that, after 2 weeks, we're going to lose the rest of the world." The bankers and the lenders and the people that wrote those rules and the politicians that went along with it, Republican and Democrat, they did something that Putin and Xi could never do. They brought this country to our knees. And 4 years later, there is $4 trillion dumped into the economy. And the little guy in the middle paid for it all. The stock value, as some of these folks refer to them, not them. And what did they get? And by the way, they're the ones that put their kids in our military too. What did they get? Nothing. They got nothing. And so we can debate about how everyone needs to, go back to the days of the 1990s. It's not happening. And you know what? I sound a little bit like Bernie Sanders too, don't I? That's because we are at a point in this country where so many people have been left behind, and so many people feel screwed over by the lawlessness, the illegal immigration. You got plexiglass in CVS's in every city. Look what's happened in San Francisco. What happened? People have been left behind. So now you have a choice to make. You can choose nationalism of the left or nationalism of the right. You get to pick now, because of all these great people that have been serving everybody that no one seems to understand have been so great. That's because they don't feel it, and that they feel left behind, and now we have a choice to make. I think that's a slight overstatement, but I think it's important to consider that as part of this equation, people feel left behind, screwed over, and no one cares about them, and they're looking for an answer.
I think this is an important admonition, if a slightly demagogic one, because I do, and Richard said it. I mean, I do think a lot of people feel let down. We've gone through a series of national traumas. Reince is right. People deeply resented the TARP that saved the financial system from collapsing. I was in some of those meetings, and what could have happened was so catastrophic that the people who Reince says he's speaking for would have been absolutely devastated. But a lot of people felt like the guys at the top get bailouts, the guys at the bottom get handouts, and I get screwed. And people were radicalized by that. Now, I will point out that the government got every dollar back with interest. But it's good. It is a good talk. It is a good way. So let me finish. It's a good talking point, and Donald Trump and others affected on the left and the right. So I think that our leaders need to be responsive to what people are feeling. 56% of the American people say they feel government is corrupt and is rigged against them. 56%. That has to be addressed, but it should be addressed in a constructive way and not just as a vehicle for demagogic candidates to get elected to office so that they can abuse them. And that is my concern. But I do, well, never mind, go ahead.
Right, so let me ask you something. And we've all kind of seen this. Most presidents, going back to Kennedy and before, when they're elected, they walk in the Oval Office. And the one thing they find out very quickly is that whatever they want to get done is not easy to do.
That's true.
Because there are rules, because there are laws, because there's bureaucracy, because there's all kinds of obstacles. When Trump walked in, you were there as chief of staff.
Yeah.
When Trump walked into the Oval Office and ran into some of these kinds of issues, what was his reaction?
Well, I mean, he was, he wanted things done now. I mean, he was the kind of guy that like, what's going on with this? Whatever we're going to do, we're going to undo NAFTA. It's like, wait a minute, we got to go to the trade committees, we got to go talk to Orrin Hatch. So we had to go through our round of hurdles, but there is something that does happen to presidents, even Trump, when they walk into that White House for the first day. It's a special day. You guys have been there. And I remember I was eating dinner with the president up in the residence, and he said, you want to go down to the Oval Office? I said, that would be great, let's go. So I had never been in the Oval Office, even though I'd been in D.C. for 6 years as chair. Of course, David and Barack Obama never invited me to the Oval Office when I was chair. I remember just getting into the Oval at the time because it was dark and we're following the Secret Service downstairs and through the colonnade. And we walked into the Oval Office and it was dark. It was really quiet, just like this. And I remember looking at the president, and I think these things fell off of me, but I put these in my pocket. These are the cords for the mic. So I walked into the Oval, and I remember looking at the president. It was the first time I saw that look, like that weight, even on Trump, because he always wants to be like that force of nature. And he walked in, and I remember he was just standing there like this. He's just looking at the ceiling, and it's an interesting ceiling, but it's just a bunch of like, and I looked at him, and he looked at me, and he said, "Can you believe it?" I said, "No, Mr. President, I can't believe it." And I walked onto my office, and you're running the federal government. There's no training. There's no like orientation. It's just a Bible verse and a password to the computer, and you're it.
That's it.
You're running it.
Let
That's
me,
how it is.
One of the reasons there was no training is there was almost no cooperation with the transition
no,
team.
we actually did. No, actually, wait, that's not true.
It is true.
No, that's not true at all. In fact, we had lunch with all the former chiefs of staff,
Yep.
and Dennis McDonough, who was the outgoing chief of staff of Barack Obama, was very helpful, very kind. And I think the person I talked to the most, other than Jim Baker, but the person I talked to the most in the transition and in the first couple months of me being chief of staff was Rahm Emanuel, who you had this similar thing. When you're the first chief in, all you do is make everybody mad. Because you're not getting the office you want, you're not getting the title you want. It's all no, no, no. So,
Actually, Richard, the people who didn't get the training were the next administration because the guy who lost wouldn't leave. So
I think you may have been referring to the other one. Yeah.
We're at the halfway point, more than the halfway point.
We're losing
I
control.
want to take a moment to recognize our question review team, the people that are responsible for selecting the questions that will be presented to our speakers, and I ask you to hold your applause while I introduce the entire group. Helen Barrington, who's General Manager of KZU Radio, Mike Clancy, who's a co-host of KSQD Radio, David Kellogg, Managing Editor of the Monterey Herald, and Pam Marino, who's a reporter with the Monterey County Weekly. Would you please thank them? And Sylvia and I want to thank the Panetta Institute Board of Directors and our lecture series sponsors who make these programs possible and allow us to share these important discussions with all of you, our audience watching at home, and with students across Central and Northern California. Please give our sponsors a hand as well. Thank you. Let me start, Richard, this is in your ballpark. What will the impact of Donald Trump's election have on United States foreign policy and United States leadership?
Well, that'll take us through the rest of the night. Look, let me say one thing before that, which is people are going to watch the election, the debates around the world. They'll watch the election. They'll watch the 75 days between Election Day and Inauguration Day. They'll watch what comes after. So all this, and to use the old phrase from the Vietnam protests, the whole world will be watching. And that will, and just when good things happen here, for example, when we went through things like the Civil Rights Movement, it was a powerful expression of American democracy's ability to correct its flaws. And when terrible things happen here, like January 6th, it sent a message that democracy here was was deeply flawed and struggling with it. So, the entire world is watching. The world doesn't get a chance to vote in our election, but they're deeply affected by it, which is a source of, more than, a little unease. Joe Biden's foreign policy is pretty familiar with them, with much of the world. It's what I would call alliance first. It's supportive of most of the institutions and machinery that have informed American foreign policy over the last 3/4 of a century. And again, the principal characteristic is to work with our partners, particularly in Europe and in Asia. He's been strongly, not unconditionally, but strongly supportive of Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression. He has been trying to strengthen our ability to go to bat for Taiwan in order to deter Chinese aggression. He's been critical of Israel, though there's been at times a mismatch between his words and his policies with Israel. But those are sort of the basic elements of Joe Biden's foreign policy. I think for Donald Trump, it's America first, not alliances first. Tends to be more transactional. Allies don't enjoy a special place in particular. I think there's a lot of unease about how much pressure he'll put on them to spend more and do more. A lot of concern that our security commitments to them have become conditional rather than unconditional. This is felt in both Asia as well as in Europe. So a lot of them are beginning to think about what is their own national security policy in a context where the United States is not as reliable or as predictable as it has been, and some will be try to become more self-reliant. Some are looking for new partners. Some may actually defer to powerful adversaries. I think most of the world views a Trump presidency with a little bit of unease. The exceptions might be mostly in the Middle East, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and a few countries there. And I think some of the more authoritarian countries, I think the Russians, the Chinese, North Koreans, and so forth might welcome it. But what more can I tell you? I think the biggest concern, I think more than anything, is that traditionally in American elections, continuity is much stronger than discontinuity. And I think that's not true this time. So the rest of the world is just uneasy. It's a little bit, we'll see what comes our way. But I think, whether you read The Economist or listen to the BBC, I think the major sense in the rest of the world is disquiet. That the Biden approach is essentially familiar. The United States has been largely, not always, but largely successful in the world for 3/4 of a century. And they're just nervous about the uncertainty about what might come and what it might mean for them.
Okay. David, young people seem to be losing enthusiasm for Biden as a result of what's happening in Gaza. Do you think this will have a significant impact on the election?
Look, I think it's a concern. There's no doubt that the war has not been helpful, and not just with young people, but with minority voters who identify with the Palestinians more readily. But I think it's also a mistake to assume that the disillusionment of young people is solely or even principally as a result of Gaza. I think that if you poll them, what you find is that economic concerns and their concerns about their own economic future are much more prevalent than Gaza, and issues like student loans, for example, are quite high. But other elements of what's my future going to hold. This is an issue. Joe Biden won younger voters by significant numbers.
20.
Yeah, in 2020, they're running about even. He won African American voters by 75% margin. It's now like 50, and a lot of that has to do with erosion among younger black men. Hispanic voters he won 2/3 of last time. They're even now. So this is fundamentally why he is in the position that he is in. He's actually holding his own amongst college-educated white voters. He's doing pretty well among seniors, who I think have perhaps more of a sense of decorum about what they think government should look like. So I think that he needs to do some work. And part of what's interesting about the polling is there's been a transition of the bases of both parties. So now Democrats are more reliant on college-educated voters, Trump more reliant on non-college voters. What this is translated to is in special elections, in the midterm elections, lower turnout elections, Democrats have actually had an advantage because the most habitual voters tend to be older voters and college-educated voters, and they've done pretty well with those voters. The question is what the turnout's going to be in this election. And the data seems pretty clear that the larger the turnout, the more perilous it is for the president in this election, which isn't the way we used to think of these elections as Democrats. So I don't know, we'll see how it goes. And part of what has to happen for Democrats between now and November is the Biden campaign has to get on a message, stay on a message, reach people with messages that are particularly moving to them, and set up a constant contrast with Trump. They have to make this a choice. If it's a referendum on Joe Biden, notwithstanding the fact that I think he's done things that history will applaud, but history's not voting now, voters are voting. And he needs to turn this race into a comparative race to win the race, and comparative on things that matter to these voters.
Right. How do you think Robert Kennedy Jr. will affect the election?
I don't think much. I think it's going to die off. I mean, he'll take from both, but I think like a lot of third parties, I think he will slowly but surely become less and less of a factor in the race. On the Biden question, he's just fundamentally, he's got a problem. And his problem overall is, I mean, Trump has the convictions, but Biden has this problem with young people in that it's not a matter of age, it's a question of capacity. And I'm not saying whether it's mean, it sounds rude. I'm telling you about people's perceptions. When you do issue testing and you do small groups and focus groups, that's his issue. So when they think the economy's not working for him, part of it is it's not working for me because maybe this guy doesn't know what he's doing. And that is very hard to overcome for a candidate. He's at 38% approval, which is the lowest that any president's had. I mean, I think they started doing this since Eisenhower. He's at 75% of Democrats wish they had a different candidate. That's not the case in the Republican Party. You could say you don't like our candidate. There's a few Republicans that don't like Trump, some. But it's not that big. It's a small portion. And the level of enthusiasm is off the charts. So I don't know where Biden goes on these issues that are driving the electorate.
Well,
gas,
plenty of
groceries.
Go. He's just got to go there.
But he's.
I'll tell you something.
But there's none of these issues. He's within 15, 20 points.
Yeah, there's the reality of what
abortion.
There's reality of what Trump is. Yeah, I don't think many Americans are enthusiastic, for example, about scrapping the Affordable Care Act, which has provided health care for tens of millions of Americans and finally given protection to people with pre-existing conditions. I don't think people are particularly interested in repealing the pharmaceutical reforms that Biden passed that set insulin at 35%, that is going to yield finally negotiations for lower pharmaceutical prices in Medicare. I don't think people are interested in allowing states like Florida and others to essentially ban abortion. The President Trump has now said, yeah, I'm fine, I'm down with that. Flirted with the idea of, just a second.
I'll give you, but
so you asked me, there are specific issues that are really important to people, and Biden needs to drive drive those issues, and I don't think he's done that sufficiently to date. I think that he will, and people will make a judgment as to whether they want to go down this path that Trump has. You know, the major economic initiative that we know Trump is committed to is making his $1.7 trillion tax cut permanent. And that is a hugely unpopular position. And so you compare that to the things that Biden wants to do, I think you give people a pretty good sense of different directions. Biden has to do that. If he does that, I think that he has a good chance to win this election.
When Trump says, I'm going to give you a middle-class tax cut, I'm going to lower your gas prices, I'm going to make groceries the way they, you know, these are the things that move the electorate. They're not talking about, there's some, obviously, I agree with you that these things, insulin, all these things are important. I'm not downplaying it, but remember what I said in the beginning. 100,000 people in 6 states will decide this. And like I said, we know what beer they drink, what car they drive, how many kids they have, whether they missed a mortgage or not, payment. And when you have 10,000 points of consumer data on every person in these states that we're trying to win, and you're messaging to people using this data, targeting them, moving them, that's how these things are won and lost.
What are you saying, that artificial intelligence is going to determine who gets elected?
Segue. Nice segue.
No, is that?
Well, no. Well, I mean, part of it is
because
that
what you're talking about is basically data.
it's using data and targeting, turnout, messaging, and persuasion in a way that's very sophisticated. The elections can be won or lost on big, broad issues, but mostly nowadays, these elections are won and lost in the trenches. And it's knowing not just who you are, but it's knowing your 2 neighbors. And you might be a 60%er for Trump, but your 2 neighbors on our consumer data and our analysis, you 2 might be 90%ers for Trump. So we're going to use you 2 to get to our 60. And it's also knowing the psychology of the voter. You had 2 people that are pro-Second Amendments. They were in the middle of Wisconsin, or southeast Wisconsin. They're both Second Amendment voters. In the old days, we'd send them a flyer saying, David's going to stand up for your Second Amendment rights, and you 2 are the same. But the difference may be one person is, just loves guns, and they love the Bill of Rights, and they've got 30 of them, and they go hunting, and they're all about freedom, and that's a freedom constitutional message. He's going to trample on the Constitution. He doesn't care about your rights. He could care less about your freedoms. He'd be bad for you. That's like a pro-freedom Constitution message. But this other person over here might also look like Second Amendment. But that's not going to work with her, because she's got a gun, because she lives in a tough neighborhood. She's got 3 kids. She's very concerned. And it's a fear message that if this person gets elected, they're going to take away your gun. They're going to put you at risk. They're going to put your kids at risk. They're going to put your whole livelihood at risk. And they don't care about you, your life, your struggles, and all the things you worked for. Totally different. But if you don't know the data and the person that you're talking to, you're missing.
Just don't send the pro-freedom message to the people who care about abortion rights.
Well, whatever. But
look, can I just say, I'm familiar with all of this. Obviously, I worked with it, and I've worked around it all my political career. But we're here talking about democracy, and I don't want people to leave thinking that democracy is basically a video game or a virtual reality game that a bunch of people pushing buttons in a room and an algorithm is controlling. One of the problems with our democracy is that in the age of social media and big data, we are, much like what Reince is describing, we are basically, we are motivated by these algorithms, by our anger, resentment, fears, conspiracy theories, and we're driven into silos, and everybody, and where our views are sometimes informed but always affirmed, and everybody outside the silo is alien and dangerous, not just a fellow citizen who has a different point of view, but threatening and menacing. And it has turned neighbors into adversaries in a way that's really unhealthy. This is what we have to push back against in our politics. So, I mean, Reince is delivering a realpolitik message. This is how it's done now. Well, you know, you have something to say about how it's done too. And like we talk about how our leaders let us down, but we have responsibilities as citizens. And I look, California's going to do what California's going to do, but in every one of these communities, there are people who need to activate themselves and say, no, I don't want my creepy neighbor who knows what I drink, what beer I drink, to come down here and tell me that I should be, you know, I believe in things, I believe in our democracy, and I want to cast an affirmative vote. So, I mean, I'm just uncomfortable. I don't in any way, I'm not disputing anything you're saying, Reince. I'm saying that is part of the problem, that
Well,
this is what our politics has
I think that
become.
part of the problem, though, is, by the way, we do a lot of discussions like this, so we're on the same page. I think that the division in this country is very profitable. I think there's profit in division. When you write a book, the more divisive it is, the more kiss and tell it is, the more rude it is, the more money you make. Same thing in television.
Take some notes, Richard, because you've written 14 books.
Yeah, right. So unfortunately, and I think doing events like this go a long way, especially like on college campuses. When we're done, David and I are going to go have a beer together. We're not enemies.
And weirdly, Reince knows what kind of beer I'm going to have.
Let me get back to questions, Reince.
Unity's become a loser, and divisions become profit, and it's all in our media, front to back, social media too.
Okay, let me ask Richard, and this is one of the questions, what are the chances of China or another country, Russia, interfering in the November election, and how do we, as a country, address that issue?
Well, the chances that Russia or China or other countries will interfere in our elections is approximately 100%. 100%. That said, I'm more worried about our own interference in our own election. That's much more serious to me, and it gets at questions here of social media, of traditional media. We live in an age of narrowcasting, not broadcasting. Facts have become, shall we say, people play fast and loose with them. It wasn't that long ago that a certain individual used the phrase alternative facts, as if such a thing existed. So we're vulnerable. We're vulnerable to what foreigners would do, and particularly in social media. But I think we're actually more vulnerable to ourselves. And I also think we pay a price for the fact that you can graduate from virtually any school, high school or college in this country, and not have the tools to navigate this information landscape. One of the several states, beginning with New Jersey, have now introduced a requirement for literacy education. So young people can figure out, what's a fact and what's good hygiene in terms of using news sources. This ought to become something that is taught in all 50 states. We ought to be teaching civics. We need to strengthen the resilience of American democracy. We have made ourselves vulnerable. But over the next 5 months, there's not time to do this. That's why this debate is actually a lot of, people talk about the two candidates. I also think there's a lot of pressure, responsibility on the journalists. What questions they ask, how they maintain order, what they follow up with. This is going to be one of our few chances to see the candidates in an environment they don't control. So the journalists, they're acting for us there. This really is a representative democracy, and they're going to have to represent us, and their professionalism is really going to matter here, because again, we're vulnerable. There's not the time or the opportunity to fix it. So sure, the foreigners will come in and they'll try to manipulate. They understand the stakes. But again, what we've done to ourselves, what we do to ourselves, is actually much more significant. And one last thing, we've got all this legislation on the books. Essentially, social media is an unregulated universe. We have removed the responsibility of the carriers for any responsibility for the content. So again, we've got to assume that everything will be out there, and things don't come with yellow Post-it notes saying, this is factually correct, this is nonsense. So we're putting a real burden on the individual citizen, many of whom don't have the educational training to discern or aren't going to double source or triple source what's coming at them. So that's where I think, again, journalists will become they'll be in many ways the intermediary here.
As we were in the last 15 minutes of the lecture, let me ask you about the future of the political parties. Right, what's the future of the Republican Party? I mean, I remember a Republican Party that had believed in fiscal discipline, believed in national security, believed in strong defense, believed in limited government. A lot of those principles have gone out the window.
Well, I think they've gone out the window.
So what's going to happen? I mean, if Trump should lose, what happens to the Republican Party? Are they going to go back to the Republican Party of the past, or is it going to split? What do you think is going to happen?
No, I think it's still that same party. I mean, as far as like the beliefs of the party and the platform of the party, but I think that politicians let both parties down. I mean, we keep talking about national debt, and the reality is, until you're willing to take on some of these big drivers of the national debt, it's just a bunch of happy talk. And the reality is that since it takes a lot of people in Congress to make these things happen, a lot of these things don't happen. And what happens is the debt keeps rising, the spending keeps going out of control, and we end up in this situation. But it didn't just start happening. That's been happening for as long as I can remember. But I do think that the party, I do think Donald Trump's a phenomenon in the party. No doubt about it. It's a Halley's Comet that is something unique and will be, obviously forever in our history in this country. But I don't think the party fundamentals change, and but I think the party structures themselves are at risk because of the fact that so many of the folks that we've elected haven't followed through on the principles and the platform of the party.
Richard, you were a Republican. What do you think is going to happen with the Republican Party?
Well, if Donald Trump wins, then I think it doubles down, and everyone will be competing in 28 and beyond to essentially be the person who continues Trumpism. I think if he loses, I think there'll be some debates, but limited debates within the party. I don't think you'll see a formal split. Third parties are easy to talk about, very hard to bring about, particularly that have real. So my hunch is a lot of what you see is what you're going to continue to get. And I think that more traditional Republicans are going to feel a little bit homeless, which is the situation now. They don't feel comfortable in this Republican Party. Third parties are not viable. There's too many aspects of the Democratic Party they're not comfortable with. I think though some will vote for Joe Biden. Some will vote for Donald Trump. I think some will sit it out. I think that they're going to wait and see, but it could be a long wait. The characteristics you described, Leon, those are in short supply. And given the environment in which politics plays out, and also things like closed primaries, given gerrymandering, most of the incentive is to go to the end zones, not to midfield. You don't get a lot of campaign donations for compromising. So the entire incentive structure, social media, the way it operates, cable, all emphasizes going to the end zones. And so I think it's a long time before the Republican Party becomes the Republican Party I joined. People like Eisenhower, Nixon, Reagan, both Bushes. That's a very Ford. That's a very different set of policies and almost temperament than this. I think I'd be curious what David says about the Democratic Party. I think particularly if Biden loses, but even if he wins, I think there's different tendencies. I'll use a generous word in the party between more traditionalists and more progressives. And I think there's going to be some interesting, shall we say, struggles or battles in the Democratic Party about where it goes down the road.
What do you think, David?
Well, just one thing on the Republican Party. the base of the Republican Party has shifted.
Right.
And so I think, you know, I agree with Reince that Donald Trump is kind of a phenomenon, and there may be people who try and inherit the Trump base, but if they're not Trump, I'm not sure that happens. But there is, the base of the Republican Party is not a party that, for example, supports Ukraine, the base of the party, support for Ukraine, and global engagements. That is not,
free trade.
Yeah, I mean, there is a populist base in the Republican Party that's pretty powerful right now, and that Trump has amplified. In terms of, I mean, we should acknowledge, because Ryan said what he said, that we're sitting on the stage with the last budget director who actually helped lay the foundation to balance the budget. So there were people who actually did it. But you know, Donald Trump, during his years, and part of it had to do with the pandemic, but a lot of it didn't. A quarter of the debt was accumulated in those 4 years, and when he was asked about it, at least this was reported, maybe you were in the room, Reince, maybe you weren't, he said, when he was told that his tax cut would add quite a bit to the debt, to deficits and debt, he said, that's someone else's problem, we're not gonna be here. So that's not, you know, and the party didn't punish him for that. I think the Republican Party has changed quite a bit. Democratic Party has robust debates, and yes, there's a progressive wing of the Democratic Party, but the parameters, I think, are less broad. You know, I get this a lot. It's like, well, we've got our Marjorie Taylor Greenes and you've got your AOCs. You may disagree with AOC that we need, you know, national health care, or that we should have a much more robust program about climate change and so on. But that's different than saying, as Marjorie Taylor Greene apparently believes, that Jewish space lasers cause forest fires in California. That's qualitatively different. So there is a debate within the Democratic Party. But I will also say that as you look at elections, for example, there were primaries just in the last 10 days in Portland for Congress, and the more progressive candidate lost and a more center-left candidate won. Prosecutor candidate there, more centrist candidate won for prosecutor in Portland. I think that's happening all over the country. Democratic Party, at the end of the day, is a center-left party. And people share concerns about health care and other issues, but they may have different approaches to it. I think the Democratic Party actually has a lot of talent that is just waiting for the opportunity. Governors, senators, members of the Biden cabinet right now, all of whom will be credible and appealing candidates for president, and we'll see what happens.
All right, you know, we're in these last few minutes now, and it's a question I've asked other panels. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future of this country? Right?
I'm optimistic, completely optimistic. I think that these are challenges that we can overcome. And obviously I don't, because this is optimistic, I'm not going to argue with David's comments on the Democratic Party, but I think that, you know, there are things in this country that are enduring. I remember the day I left the White House. I went back several times since, but the one day I left, and that's a wild story about my last day, which would be very entertaining for you all to hear. But, you know, the White House is just that amazing, glowing building that stands for opportunity and freedom, and everything you believe in, you got there, and it's just inspiring just to see it glowing in the dark in Washington. And when I left that night, there's nothing on the outside that tells you what party and what president's on the inside. Yeah. It's that same amazing,
Richard, what do you think?
So you asked whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic, and the answer is both. I actually think
you should run for something.
I'm going to announce tonight. Actually, I'm too young. I think 2032, I'll ripen it. Look, but I actually mean there's a serious answer, not evasive. I actually think a lot's in the balance. And that wasn't true back when. Churchill's famous, Churchill's can be quoted about everything, but one of them is Americans can be counted on to do the right thing, but only after they've tried everything else. And my view, but the reason I don't say I'm optimistic, because I'm uneasy if people are sanguine. I don't think it inevitably works out just because it always has. I think there is enough that's different. And here we are, we're 2 years away. In 2 years and 1 month, we're going to mark the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And we shouldn't take for granted this democracy. We shouldn't take for granted a world that has been unbelievably supportive of American interests and values, where we've avoided major power war for 3/4 of a century. So my view is, I can argue the optimism, I can argue the pessimism. The bottom line is nothing's inevitable. Nothing's baked into the cake, and the future is going to be what we make it out to be.
Well, it's not,
David?
it's not supposed to be. I mean, you talk about that history. The people who wrote that document and wrote the Constitution understood that democracy is not a gift, it's a project. And it was a very speculative project when they wrote those documents. And they knew that it would require the vigilance of generations after generations. And maybe we got a little lazy. Maybe we got a little bit too comfortable with the fact that we have a democracy. Democracy requires active engagement on the part of all of us. But I will say this, I work with young people at the University of Chicago, at Arizona State University. When I speak to these young people, they are skeptical, as has been pointed out, but they're not cynical. And whatever their concerns about democracy and the way ours functions, they want to change the world and they want to change it for the better. They give me hope. And finally, I'll say this, like Leon, I'm the son of an immigrant. I'm the son of a refugee from Eastern Europe. And I told you this story earlier. In 2009, when Leon was there, we went to Russia with President Obama.
Wrap up, David.
Huh?
Wrap up. You got
okay.
to keep it short.
Okay, I'm going to keep it short. Well, here's the bottom line. They were playing the national anthem, our national anthem in Red Square. I had my hand over my heart. It would have been the 99th, the next day was the 99th birthday, my father's 99th birthday. And I had tears in my eyes because I was standing there and I was the senior, one generation after he came to the U.S. with nothing as a child. I was standing there as the senior advisor to the President of the United States, who was an African-American man. And it's very hard not to be an optimist when you have that experience.
Let me add, first of all, to thank my speakers for all being here. If you're worried about democracy, the most important thing is what happened on the stage tonight. Because these are people, different parties, different viewpoints, and yet they were all concerned about the future of our democracy. And that's what you, as the American people, need to be concerned about, your role in making sure that our democracy is there for our children. Thank you very much for coming tonight. Please thank those people.